Oh, okay, students. We are going to look at 3 problems that when you solve them, you get answers that include imaginary numbers. So we're going to start with this quadratic equation. I'm going to choose to solve it with the quadratic formula because I noticed that my b term of -4, I'd have to factor 10 out of that. That would give me a fraction. And if I don't have to, I don't want to do completing the square with fractions. Alright, so there's the quadratic formula. I'm going to identify a, b, and c and plug them in to the quadratic formula. Now feel free to pause this video anytime and finish taking notes, and I encourage you to take notes of all of these examples and include anything I say that will help you better understand and remember when you review your notes later. Now, as I told you in class, the first thing you should do is evaluate what's under your square root. And when I get my calculator out, I see that what's under my square root is -384. So I know that I need to factor -384 and see if I can simplify that. So I create a factoring tree over here of 384, and I find out that 384 is 4 times 4 times 4 times 6. Alrighty then. So if I rewrite the square root of -384, where -384 is factored, I got 4 times 4 times 4 times 6 from my factoring tree, and from that negative, I get a -1. Now, based on what we learned in class about imaginary numbers, that means the square root of -1 is I, and 4 times 4 times 4 simplifies to be 2 times 2 times 2 outside of the radical, and the 6 is the only thing that's in the radical. So I finish that multiplication and end up with 8i square root of 6. Okay, so that means the answer to my quadratic is 4 plus or minus 8i square root of 6 all divided by 20. I'm going to split those two fractions up and then simplify them both, and this is my final answer. 1/5 plus or minus 2/5 I square root of 6. Now, if you don't understand this simplification, copy it down and go see any Algebra 2 teacher. Our next example is a little simpler. It is x squared minus 6x plus 12. For this one, I'm going to use completing the square because my b term is even and I don't have to factor anything out. So I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides, and then I'm going to take half of b, square it, and add it to both sides. So that gives me 9. Add it to both sides. Next, I'm going to rewrite this side of the equation as a perfect square trinomial. So it's x minus half of b, so it's x minus 3 squared. And I'm going to combine like terms on this side. So I end up with x minus 3 squared is equal to -3. As you know, my next step is to take the square root of both sides, which gives me the square root of a negative number. And the minute I see that, I know that the first thing I should do is factor -1 out of that number and simplify it outside of the square root as an I. Once I've done that, I can simply add 3 to both sides, and here is my answer. 3 plus or minus I square root of 3. Our last example, we're going to use the quadratic formula again because although my b term is even, I have to factor 9 out. That would give me -4 over 9, and I don't think I want to do all that completing the square work with negative 4 over 9. So I'm going to use the quadratic formula again. I'm going to identify my A, B, and C and plug it in. And again, my B value was negative, so you notice in both of these places, I put it in parentheses, just so when I put things in the calculator, I don't mess up negative signs. Now I'm going to evaluate what's under the square root. It turns out it's negative 56. So I'm going to create a factoring tree for negative 56. But really, I'm going to focus in on things that are perfect squares. I'm not going to start with 2 because I can't take the square root of 2 and get a round number. So I'm going to focus on things that are perfect squares. And I start with 4. I wondered if negative 56 was divisible by 4, and it turns out it is. And you get 14 if you divide it by 4. And when I thought about 4, the factors of 14, none of those are perfect squares. So I knew I couldn't go any further. This is as far as I could go. So given that, I can rewrite this as 2. That comes from the square root of 4. I, that comes from the square root of negative 1. With this left over of square root 14. Alright, so then I take my answer, I split it up into 2 different fractions and simplify them both. 4 over 18 simplifies to be 2 over 9. And 2 over 18 simplifies to be 1 over 9. And I have my I square root of 14 over 9. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my answer. Now, if you have any questions, I hope you felt free to pause this video, take notes. If not, watch it again, take notes. If you have questions about a specific step or something that I did, remember, I'm not here most of next week, or you're out, so feel free to go to any Algebra 2 teacher and get help. All right, bye. Peace out and have a great long weekend.